Well, my favorite topic of discussion, Congressman Jason Chaffetz, made a post on Twitter showing that he had signed something that he called a pledge regarding a climate tax, which is how conservatives have chosen to label cap-and-trade legislation. This is a copy of the pledge that he signed. Now, the first thing I noticed about it was the letterhead. It says, Americans for Prosperity. Americans for Prosperity is a political advocacy group located in Washington, D.C. How convenient. Americans for Prosperity describes itself as an organization of grassroots leaders who engage citizens in the name of limited government and free markets on the local, state, and federal levels. Grassroots. That's one of those terms that's been getting thrown around a lot lately. Usually by rich people trying to convince poor people that it's in their best interest that billionaires get tax breaks. They also say that they advocate fiscal and regulatory restraint. Wasn't it a lack of regulation that got us all into the financial crisis we find ourselves in today? I took a look at their board of directors and some of their staff members. Americans for Prosperity is run by a bunch of people who have certainly been prosperous, like corporate executives, government insiders, and career politicians. You know, average Americans like you and me. Well, Americans for Prosperity has been floating this pledge around Washington and getting a lot of signatures, mostly from Republicans. So we know that we can count on Jason Chaffetz to get right on board. The pledge is titled, Americans for Progress, No Climate Tax Pledge. Now, most people are going to read the title and then the signature of their representative, and they're going to ignore everything else on the page, like the fine print of what the pledge actually says, and they're probably not going to bother to look into Americans for Prosperity and find out exactly what their political agenda is. You know, it's too bad that we live in a culture that doesn't read the fine print. Now, tell the truth. Have you ever read the end-user license agreement when you upgrade to the latest version of iTunes? As such, most people are just going to assume that the pledge is about taxes, because it said so right here. Tax pledge. I'm not a lawyer, and of course this isn't a legal contract. It's a pledge, and people make pledges all the time, especially politicians. People also break their pledges all the time, especially politicians. Even President Obama got himself into a little hot water recently because he had to go back on a pledge that he made during the campaign. He wanted his administration to be completely transparent. However, once he got into office, he quickly learned that you can't be transparent about everything, especially on matters of national security. That's just the world we live in. Nevertheless, we do hold our elected officials to a higher standard, and in so doing, we obligate ourselves to pay closer attention to political gimmicks, ideological tokens like this. Oh, who am I kidding? This is pure politics. So, let's take the time to examine just what Jason Chaffetz has pledged to do. The title clearly says, No Climate Tax Pledge. Remember, climate tax is Republican for cap and trade. Now that's a pretty descriptive title, and like I said, most people just assume that the pledge discusses a climate tax. But anyone who actually reads the pledge will find that the words climate tax are nowhere to be found in it. The signatory has actually pledged to oppose any legislation relating to climate change that includes a net increase in government revenue. Now, why would Americans for Prosperity and their GOP ilk make such a big deal about this climate tax pledge and not include the word tax in the fine print? Especially after we've gotten so used to Republicans in Congress complaining about climate taxes, energy consumption taxes, and of course, cap and trade taxes. Well, I know exactly why they've decided to pull this little semantic bait and switch. Because they've known from the very beginning that when it comes time to debate the issue on the floors of the House and Senate, their tax argument isn't going to hold any water because, as I've said before, cap and trade is not a tax! So what are they actually talking about when they say net increase in government revenue? Well, cap and trade involves the use of carbon credits, and carbon credits are made available to companies by the government, either by issuing them for free or by selling them. Guess who wants to sell them? And, of course, selling carbon credits would result in a net increase in government revenue, justifying the GOP's pledge to oppose it. Of course, they'll just turn around and tell their constituents that they voted against a new tax. But I'm willing to bet that even if the final version of the cap-and-trade legislation decided against selling the carbon credits and just issued them for free, the GOP would still vote against it, for purely political reasons. That's basically what they did with the stimulus package. It started out at over $800 billion. But the GOP insisted on changes, and Democrats accommodated them in the interest of bipartisanship, which included a smaller middle-class tax cut than what the president had wanted. And Republicans voted against it anyway. There are economists out there who don't think that the stimulus package was big enough to do any good. If that turns out to be true, then who do we have to thank for it? But these days, when we're talking about deficit spending and the national debt, doesn't it make sense to find alternative sources of revenue for the government? Cue the tired response from the GOP. We need to make government smaller by cutting spending and taxes. They just can't stop ringing that bell. Meanwhile, here on planet Earth, hey, Republicans, don't you realize that nobody in Congress has got the stones to cut spending? Not even you. But what really bothers me about this is what these people are saying by signing this pledge. It's in black and white. I will oppose. This is a promise to hinder, not to help. And judging from their rhetoric and behavior so far, they're not just going to oppose legislation. They're going to do everything they can to undermine it. They'll demand compromises in exchange for their support. But their true aim will be to weaken the effectiveness of the legislation, and then vote against it anyway. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for checks and balances. I don't usually think of checks and balances in obstructionist terms. I'm a big believer in compromise, as were past presidents like George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Of course, George Bush Sr. decided to compromise on taxes with a democratically controlled Congress, which wound up costing him the election in '92. When Bill Clinton compromised with the Republican-controlled Congress, we got federal budget surpluses and started to actually pay down the national debt. I have said in the past that gridlock can be a good thing, because the less that government is doing, the less it can do to you. But there are times when the government needs to act, and I think now is one of those times. Of course, compromise requires participants to have an open mind. Making a pledge like this is not characteristic of someone with an open mind. And I'm getting sick and tired of seeing interviews with Republican congressmen who are long on criticism and short on alternatives. And since the only person I can address my concerns to is my own representative, I'd like to ask him a question and see if at least he has the courage and decency to give me a straight answer. All right, Jason, I get it. You don't like cap and trade, and it's reasonable to assume that you'd also be against a direct carbon tax. So, what's your solution to reducing carbon emissions? The ball's in your court, pal. Are you courageous enough to answer the hard questions, or are you just going to keep ignoring me?